Peking 1900, a city of 2 million souls trapped inside walls within walls. All of them baking under a sun that seemed to want to set the world on fire. If you stood on the Tartar Wall in May of that year, you would see a sight that shouldn't exist. A miniature version of Paris and London, complete with grand pianos, champagne, and stone cathedrals. Nestled like a foreign cyst inside the heart of the oldest empire on Earth. But the air was changing. The breeze didn't carry the smell of spring. It carried the scent of parched earth and the low, rhythmic chanting of men who believed they were invincible to bullets. We often think of history as a series of dates, but in 1900 history was a feeling, a tightening of the throat, silence in the telegraph wires, and the realization that the gates were about to close. The Legation Quarter was a tiny rectangular enclave, barely 3/4 of a mile long. To the Europeans living there, it was a sanctuary of civilization. To the Chinese outside, it was a hive of devils. The data of the time tells us there were only about 500 foreign guards protecting roughly 3,000 civilians, including missionaries and merchants. They were surrounded by the imperial army of the Qing Dynasty of thousands strong, and an unpredictable tide of boxers numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Every morning, the diplomats would gather at the Peking Club to discuss the boxer nuisance over gin and tonics. Even as the smoke from burning railway stations began to smudge the horizon, they relied on a delicate balance of power that was about to vanish. A woman who had ruled from behind a silk screen for decades was playing a deadly game of wait and see. Would she use the boxers to sweep the foreigners into the sea? Or would she crush the rebels to appease the Western powers? But while the diplomats played billiards, the real story was written in the dust. You see, Peking hadn't seen a drop of rain in months. In a society built on agriculture, a drought isn't just bad weather, it's a divine omen. The real data of the 1900 famine shows that crop failures in the surrounding Shandong province had pushed millions to the brink of starvation. They didn't blame the weather, they blamed the foreign devils and their magic wires, the telegraph, for upsetting the feng shui of the land. The stage was set for a tragedy where superstition met steel. And the first casualties weren't soldiers, they were the very nerves of the modern world. Inside the legation walls, the architecture was a defiant display of the Victorian era. The British legation was the largest, a sprawling compound of 12 acres with manicured gardens that felt like a slice of Oxfordshire. Here, the great game of Victorian politics was played out in stifling silk suits. Imagine the sound of a string quartet playing Mozart, the music drifting out of an open window, only to be drowned out by the distant thump-thump of a boxer drum across the canal. The smell of coldest Peking's signature scent mixing with the expensive French perfume of the ladies. In 1900, the legation was the only place in North China where you could find a library of Latin classics or a cellar of fine claret. But this luxury was a gilded cage. The real history reveals that by late May, the price of eggs in the quarter had tripled. The supply lines were fraying. The mule trains that brought in fresh vegetables from the hills were stopping. Why does this matter to us now? Because we are seeing the final hours of the old world before the 20th century officially turned violent. The diplomats thought they were safe because of international law, but law only exists as long as the person holding the sword agrees with it. As the sun set over the yellow-tiled roofs of the Forbidden City, the foreigners looked at their watches, synchronized to Greenwich Mean Time, while the Chinese looked at the stars. Two different versions of time were about to collide in a spectacular explosion of violence. Across the city, in the Forbidden City, the old Buddha Empress Cixi was receiving reports. She was told that the boxers were spirit soldiers who could fly and were immune to cannon fire. This sounds like myth, but to the Qing court in 1900, it was a strategic data point. The empress was caught in a pincer movement of history. If she sided with the foreigners, her people would overthrow her as a puppet. If she sided with the boxers, the eight-nation alliance would invade and burn her palaces to the ground. She spent that final summer walking in her gardens, watching the dragonflies, and listening to the whispers of her eunuchs. The data of the court records shows she was sending secret encouragement to the boxer leaders, even while sending apologies to the foreign ministers. It was a masterclass in double dealing that would eventually cost her the empire. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the empress's indecision, was the silence of the telegraph. On June 10th, the line to Tianjin was cut. The last message received was a plea for help. Suddenly, the most powerful men in the world, the representatives of the British, American, and Russian empires, were as isolated as if they were on the moon. They were no longer ministers, plenipotentiary. They were targets. And as the first fires began to rise in the outer city, lighting up the night sky like a false dawn, the civilians in the legation realized they had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed their civilization was a shield. The threshold had been crossed. The Boxer Rebellion wasn't just a riot, it was a total rejection of the Western world. As the screaming started at the Hadamen Gate, the residents of the Legation Quarter grabbed whatever they could, old hunting rifles, kitchen knives, and sandbags, and began to prepare for a siege that no one believed they would survive. The last summer of the old Peking was over. The 55 days of fire had begun. If you were a common laborer in Peking in June 1900, your world wasn't defined by diplomacy. It was defined by the ache in your stomach and the dust in your lungs. While the foreigners inside the legation were worried about the price of champagne, the people of the outer city were watching their children die of thirst. The sky was a hard, polished bowl of brass, and every day without rain was a day closer to the end of the world. In the tea houses and the shadow play theaters, a new word was being whispered, not a name, but an action. Shui. To smash. They weren't just planning to smash the foreigners. They were planning to smash the very modernity that was erasing their way of life. To understand Peking's soul, you have to understand its geometry. The city was a series of nested boxes. At the center was the Forbidden City, then the Imperial City, then the Tartar City, and finally the Southern Outer City. In 1900, the population density of the Southern City was staggering, roughly 40,000 people per square mile. The real data from census records and missionary journals describes a city where 70% of the population lived in extreme poverty, surviving on millet and memories. While the Legation Quarter had wide macadamized roads, the rest of Peking was a labyrinth of Hutong's narrow alleys, where the sunlight rarely touched the ground. These alleys were the city's nervous system. In 1900, they were choked with human scavengers who collected night soil, and water sellers who hawked brackish liquid from wooden carts. The sensory data is overwhelming. The smell of fermenting waste, the thick blue smoke of cheap tobacco, and the constant rhythmic clack-clack of the night watchman's bamboo stick. But beneath this daily struggle, a spiritual fire was being lit. Have you ever wondered how a peasant with a pitchfork decides to challenge a man with a Maxim gun? It started with the spirit boxers. These weren't professional soldiers or teenagers, displaced canal workers and farmers. They practiced long fist boxing in the dusty squares of the southern city. The data suggests that by June, there were over 800 shrines or training grounds across Peking. They believed that through ritual breathing and spells, they could invite the spirits of ancient heroes, the Monkey King or the god of war, to inhabit their bodies. They weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting a holy war against foreign magic. One of the most engaging pieces of historical data from 1900 is the Chinese reaction to Western technology. To the boxers, the telegraph lines weren't just wires. They were devil's iron that pierced the earth's veins and drained the luck of the land. The steam engines were fire chariots that disturbed the ancestors. In the markets near the Chenmen Gate, you could see the clash of eras. A merchant might be selling traditional medicinal dragon bones, actually ground up fossils, right next to a shop selling German-made kerosene lamps. This friction created a psychological static electricity. Every time a Westerner rode a bicycle through a crowded market or a missionary built a church steeple higher than the local pagoda, it was seen as a deliberate act of spiritual aggression. The real history shows that the boxers' first targets weren't people, but things. They tore up the railway tracks and smashed the streetlights, trying to reset the world to a purer time. But who were the victims of this reset? It wasn't just the white foreigners. The most tragic data point of 1900 is the fate of the secondary devils, the Chinese Christians. There were roughly 30,000 Catholics and Protestants in Peking at the time. To their neighbors, they were traitors who had abandoned their ancestors for a foreign god. As the heat reached its peak in mid-June, the soul of the streets turned dark. The Boxers began the Great Purification. If you couldn't recite a Buddhist sutra, or if you had a Bible in your house, your home was marked with a red circle. The real data of the massacres in the northern cathedral area is chilling. Thousands of Chinese converts were slaughtered in a single week, their bodies left in the hutsongs as a warning. The turning point for the soul of the city occurred on June 13th. A massive crowd of Boxers, dressed in their signature red sashes and turbans, surged through the Hatamen Gate. They didn't go for the legations first. They went for the symbols of Western commerce. They burned the Book of the Foreigner, the vast retail stores and pharmacies. The sensory data of that night is haunting. The sky over Peking turned a bruised, flickering orange. The heat from the fires was so intense that it melted the lead on the roofs of nearby temples. The clatter of hooves wasn't from carriages anymore, but from the big sword cavalry, the Gansu braves who were even more radical than the Boxers. These were Muslim soldiers from the west of China, led by General Tung Fuxiang, who hated the Europeans with a religious intensity. They rode through the streets of Peking shouting, "Kill, steal," and the common people, fueled by months of hunger and propaganda, joined the chorus. Think about the psychological state of the city at this moment. The real history isn't just about battles. It's about the collapse of the social contract. The police force of Peking the Bannermen simply vanished or joined the mob. There was no law, there was only the will of the spirits. Inside the Legation Quarter, the foreigners could hear the roar of the crowd, a sound like a breaking wave that never ended. They realized that the Peking they thought they knew, the quaint, exotic city of curios and silk, was a fiction. The real Peking was a furnace of rage that had been stoking for 60 years, since the First Opium War, as the streets and the soul of Peking transitioned into total war. The real data shows that the city's grain reserves were almost empty. The Boxers promised that their magic would provide food, but as the fires burned the granaries, the reality set in. The city was eating itself. The streets were now a battlefield, where the only currency was ammunition and blood. The Westerners, even in their fear, maintained a strange hubris. They still expected the Chinese rabble to flee at the first volley of gunfire, but the Boxers didn't flee. They walked into the bullets, believing their charms would protect them. When they died, the others didn't stop. They believed the fallen Boxer simply hadn't been pure enough. This wasn't a battle of tactics. It was a battle of faith versus physics. By the end of June, the streets had won. The foreigners were pushed back behind their final barricades. The southern city was a smoking ruin, and the Imperial Army had finally unslung its modern Krupp cannons. The soul of the city was now unified in a single, desperate purpose: the total erasure of the West. But as the first artillery shells began to whistle over the legation walls, a new question emerged. Who was really in control? Was it the Boxers, the generals, or the silent woman in the Forbidden City? While the streets of Peking screamed with the sounds of fire and ritual, a much colder, more calculated game was being played in the shadows of the throne room and the war offices. This wasn't just a riot, it was a geopolitical earthquake. In the summer of 1900, the power of the world was concentrated in a few square miles of Peking, and the plot involved 8 empires, 1 dying dynasty, and a woman who was arguably the most powerful person on the planet. History books often call this the Boxer Rebellion, but the real data suggests it was something much more complex. It was the first true world war fought on a single city's streets. Let's look at the real data of the conflict. On June 20th, the German minister, Baron von Kettler, was shot dead in the street by a Manchu soldier. This was the point of no return. Within hours, the Qing Empire officially declared war on the world. The siege of the Legation Quarter began in earnest. The numbers were impossible. The foreigners were outnumbered at least 100 to 1. They had only one modern piece of artillery, an old brass cannon they nicknamed the International because it used an English carriage, a Russian barrel, and Italian shells. The real history reveals that the only reason the legations survived the first week was not due to Western superiority, but due to a secret plot within the Chinese government. Have you ever wondered how 500 sailors held off an entire army for nearly 2 months? The answer lies in the plot. Not every Chinese official wanted the foreigners dead. A powerful faction of moderates in the Qing court, led by Prince Qing, and the general Zheng Lu, realized that if they actually slaughtered the diplomats, the Western powers would turn China into a colony forever. While the Boxers were charging the barricades with swords, Zhenglu was secretly holding back his modern Krupp artillery. He was firing to miss. He provided just enough pressure to satisfy the Empress's rage, but not enough to actually finish the job. Empress Dowager Cixi was the master of this plot. The data from the Diary of the Forbidden City shows her oscillating between madness and brilliance. She would send boxes of watermelons and ice to the besieged foreigners as a gesture of peace one day. And the next, she would offer a bounty of 50 taels of silver for every foreign head brought to the palace. She was waiting for a sign. She believed that if the Boxers truly had spirit magic, she could use them to tear up the unequal treaties that had humiliated China since the Opium Wars. She was using the Boxers as a human shield against the 20th century. The power she wielded was ancient, based on the mandate of heaven. But she was facing a new kind of power, the industrial, relentless force of the Eight-Nation Alliance. But who was this alliance? This is a crucial data point often missed. It was a fragile coalition of Britain, America, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. These nations actually hated each other. In any other year, they would have been at war over borders in Europe or colonies in Africa. But the Peking plot forced them into an uneasy brotherhood. Back inside the legation, the power was shifting from the diplomats to the engineers. The foreigners dug over 2 miles of trenches. They turned the British legation into a fortress, using thousands of sandbags made from expensive silk curtains and ladies' evening gowns. The sensory data of the siege was the smell of horseflesh. By July, there was no beef or mutton left. The elite racing ponies of the Peking Club were slaughtered one by one to feed the children. The real history of the siege is found in the ledgers of the committee. Every ounce of flour was rationed. Every drop of water was guarded. The diplomats who once argued over seating arrangements at dinner were now huddled in basements, listening to the shriek of Chinese rockets overhead. But there was another siege happening, the silent siege of the northern cathedral, the Beitang. While the world focused on the diplomats, 3,000 Chinese Christians and a handful of French priests were being starved and mined by the Boxers. The data here is even more gruesome. The Boxers dug tunnels and planted massive mines under the cathedral. One explosion killed over 100 children in an instant. This was the plot. At its most visceral, the attempt to literally blow the roots of Western religion out of Chinese soil. Outside Peking, the power was marching. An army of 50,000 men was moving up the Paiho River. The data on this march is a grim record of the century of humiliation. As the alliance troops moved toward Peking, they didn't just fight, they liquidated every village they passed. The real history shows that the civilized Western troops were just as brutal as the Boxers they were coming to suppress. By the time they reached the walls of Peking in mid-August, the plot had shifted from rescue to retribution. On August 14th, the power finally broke through. The British Indian troops, the Sikhs, were the first to enter the legation through a drainage tunnel under the wall. The siege was over, but the plot was just entering its darkest phase. The Empress Dowager fled the city in a common cart, dressed as a peasant, while her spirit soldiers vanished into the dust. Peking was now a conquered city. And the Eight Empires were about to show the world what happens when civilization decides to take its revenge. The relief of the legation wasn't a happily ever after. It was the start of a nightmare for the city of Peking, as the gates fell and the foreign flags were raised over the Tartar walls. The gilded summer ended in a winter of looting and execution. The city that had trembled on the edge had finally fallen over the precipice. But history doesn't just stop when the guns fall silent. Once the siege was lifted, Peking was divided into 8 zones, each controlled by a different foreign power. What followed was a systematic plunder of a civilization. The real data of the looting is staggering. From the Forbidden City alone, thousands of priceless artifacts, jade carvings, ancient scrolls, and the Empress's own pearls were packed into crates and shipped to museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. The sensory data of the occupation was the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking porcelain. Many foreign soldiers, fueled by the retribution mindset, didn't distinguish between Boxers and civilians. The execution records from 1900 to 1901 show that thousands of Chinese men were beheaded in the markets of the southern city, often with little to no evidence of their involvement in the rebellion. The soul of the city was being systematically broken. Why does this matter to the world today? Because the Boxer Protocol, the peace treaty signed in 1901, was the most lopsided data set in history. China was forced to pay an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, roughly $333 million at the time, or billions in today's currency. To put that in perspective, this debt was more than the entire annual tax revenue of the Qing Empire. It was designed to keep China in financial chains for 39 years. Every time a Chinese citizen paid for a bag of rice for the next 4 decades, a portion of that money went to pay for the bullets that had killed their neighbors in 1900. While her capital was being looted, the Empress Dowager Cixi was on a Great Western inspection, a polite euphemism for a desperate escape. She traveled nearly 700 miles in a wooden cart, sleeping in peasant huts and eating coarse grain. This experience changed her. The data from her return to Peking in 1902 shows a woman who finally realized that spirit magic could unstop a machine gun. When she returned, she began the new policy reforms, attempting to modernize the army and the schools. But it was too much, too late. The real history shows that by trying to save the dynasty through modernization, she inadvertently created the very class of educated, military-minded revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen who would overthrow her successor just 3 years after her death. But let's look at the legacy of the walls, the Legation Quarter. Once a symbol of survival, became a symbol of occupation. The foreigners didn't leave. They built even higher walls and banned Chinese people from entering the quarter without a pass. The sensory data of the 1900s was a city under a permanent siege of its own making. This humiliation created a deep, simmering national memory that still drives Chinese foreign policy today. In China, 1900 is remembered as the height of the century of humiliation, a data point that is taught in every school to ensure it never happens again. We must also account for the ghost data, the people who vanished. It is estimated that between the Boxer massacres of Christians and the Alliance's punitive expeditions, over 100,000 people died in North China. The Boxer Rebellion wasn't just a political event, it was a demographic catastrophe. Entire villages were erased from the map. The real history isn't found in the medals of the generals, but in the empty ancestral halls across the Shandong and Jili provinces. What is the final lesson of the Peking summer? It is a lesson in the danger of isolation and hubris. The foreigners were isolated in their gilded enclave, oblivious to the suffering of the people outside their walls. The Boxers were isolated in their superstition, believing that faith was a substitute for reality. And the Empress was isolated in her palace, believing she could play both sides of a fire. When these isolations collided, the explosion didn't just burn. Peking it signaled the end of the Age of Empires. As we look back at the drawings and photographs of 1900, we see a Peking that no longer exists. The Great Walls have been torn down to make way for ring roads. The Forbidden City is a museum. But if you walk through the few remaining hutongs on a hot, breathless July afternoon, you can almost hear the echo of that feverish summer. The rhythm of the city, its greed and its grace, its violence and its beauty remains. London in 1640, Peking in 1900. They are chapters in the same book of human restlessness. The maps change, the technology evolves, but the soul of the city remains a mirror, reflecting our greatest fears and our most desperate ambitions. Thank you for walking these ancient streets with me. If you want to see more tours of the Brink, subscribe and join us for our next journey into the heart of history.